I have talked about shooting interior photos in little pieces throughout a number of videos, but today I'm going to expand on this subject in depth and compile all my interior techniques into one place. I ended up with the most information-dense video I've ever made. This is far more complex than can be put into a catchy, numbered list of tips because there are so many variables. So instead of a nice listicle, I've divided this into 4 categories. Location, that's your setting, surroundings, time of day. Car, things you can do and look for with your car subject that will make your life easier. Lenses, basic settings for your camera, and finally, shooting technique, actually pointing the camera and taking the photo. If you have the first 3 sorted out, most of the work will already be done for you for that last critical step. So here we go. I find that the biggest challenge of shooting car interiors is unwanted contrast. This could be contrast from inside the car versus what's outside the windows, or contrast from sunlight coming through, lighting up certain parts of the interior but casting shadows on other parts. So you want to choose a location where you can have shade during daylight hours. Generally, a couple hours before sunset, the shadows are long enough that you can park somewhere near something tall and be in full shade. You also want a location that has a distraction-free background outside of the car. Trees, walls, simple structures are generally best. Just watch out for something really busy outside of the car that will show up through the windows and distract from the interior. You also probably want to be parked somewhere level so that everything in the background isn't askew, which can be really distracting. Once you've found your position, it's time to look at the car. Before you take a single interior photo, ask yourself a few questions about the car. Does it have a light interior or a dark interior? Are there 4 doors or 2 doors? Is it a convertible? Does the car have screens in it? A light interior like gray or tan is naturally brighter and easier to shoot. Straight away, it will show up warmer, more defined, with more visible details, and there's less contrast between the interior and the view outside the car. On the other hand, black is a very common interior color, and it is more challenging. Black can be shiny and have a glare on the seats and dashboard. We can fix this by using a circular polarizer to find a position that balances the light on these surfaces and reduces the contrast or glare. The goal is to flatten this out if we can. One reason that photos of black interiors often look bad is that they are too bright. If the camera sees everything in the frame as black, then it will compensate so that nothing is black. You'll notice this especially when you're shooting carpet and floor mats. The auto exposure will boost everything to gray, and the ground or door jamb will be blown out if it shows up in part of the frame. If we're trying to realistically capture an interior as it looks in person, it's okay if some parts are lost in shadows, so it generally helps to use manual settings or exposure compensation to underexpose a couple stops so that the blacks stay black and your camera doesn't try to make everything gray. For a wide shot of the full dashboard and interior, you'll notice that a 2-door car with its longer doors offers more access and doesn't have a B-pillar blocking your view of the seats. If the car has 4 doors, you can still shoot from either side of the car, but you're closer to the dashboard and your view is restricted. So with a 4-door car, remember to take advantage of having a back seat and shoot pictures of the dash and steering wheel from the middle of the back seat. If it's a convertible, you can put the top down and get nice, unobstructed perspectives from a bunch of angles around the car, and the lighting will usually be very even and forgiving. If you have long arms, you can get a central shot of the dashboard from behind the seats, even if the car doesn't have a rear seat. In an old car, you probably don't need to have the car running for the interior photos once you've shot the gauge cluster. But if the car has screens, you'll need to have the car on for most of the interior photos where the screens are visible. To me, it looks incomplete if the screens are off and if there's an ugly void in the middle of the dash. Unfortunately, infotainment screens are still pretty ugly when they're on. So one thing I like to do to improve the aesthetic is to go in the vehicle settings and try to find a night mode if there's an option, so the display is dark with white text instead of being a big white glowing rectangle in the middle of the dashboard. If it has Alcantara or suede-like seats, Try to brush the material into one direction so that the pile looks nice and uniform and doesn't have like distracting butt prints. A few universal tips that apply to any car. Keep the steering wheel straight. The steering wheel should always be perfectly straight. It looks so jarring and amateur when you see the steering wheel turned 90 degrees in an interior photo, and it's such an easy fix. Roll down the windows and always have the opposite door closed if you're shooting from one side of the car. So if I'm shooting the driver's seat from the driver's side, have the passenger door closed. I think it just looks better that way. Before you take out your camera, this is a good time to look at the dash and do a final wipe down for any dust that may have accumulated anywhere or loosened up during the drive to your location. Finally, it's time to look at your camera settings. Your camera has 3 primary exposure parameters: shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. For shutter speed, it's a general rule that you can shoot 1/60th or faster handheld pretty comfortably without camera shake. So we want to stay at least at that speed. You're not going to have time to use a tripod for every shot. Plus, that would limit your possible perspectives to where you can place the tripod. So keep it at 1/60th or 1/100th or above. For your aperture, there's usually no benefit to shooting an interior at f2.8 or f1.8. We want most of the interior to be sharp because ultimately we are documenting what's there. I usually shoot at f4 or f5, so a lot of what's in the frame is in focus. We could shoot everything at f11 for more sharpness, but everything in photography is a balance, and we would have to drastically compromise our shutter speed or ISO for that, and I don't think that trade-off is worth it. But that brings us to our last setting, ISO. And I'll tell you, don't fear high ISO. Interiors are usually already dark, it's late in the day, and we're in the shade. You may have to raise the ISO a lot, and that's perfectly okay. With most cameras made in the last decade, images usually look fine at 2,000 or 3,000 ISO. I've shot interiors indoors and cranked up the ISO past 4,000, and it was totally fine. Technology has improved, and the flexibility a higher ISO gives you with your aperture and shutter speed for handheld photos is amazing. Now let's talk about lenses. You're probably best off with a lens in the neighborhood of 24mm or even 20mm. If it's a longer lens, like 35 or 50, you won't be able to fit everything in, and if it's too wide, you'll be dealing with some obvious distortion. Now for details, go nuts. Use a long lens or whatever you want, but to get the full shot of the interior or to get a modern bucket seat in the frame, you'll need a wider lens such as 20 or 24mm. You'll also want to have a circular polarizer on that lens, like I mentioned earlier, to minimize glare and contrast on the interior surfaces. A CPL is a useful tool for modifying the appearance of light before it hits your camera sensor. I have a video all about CPL filters at the link right there. Now we have the location sorted, the car is configured, and your camera and lens are ready to go. Let's actually take some photos. When you're shooting a wide interior shot, make sure the steering wheel is in focus. It's the focal point of the interior, so even if you're shooting from the passenger side, the center of the steering wheel should be sharp. Sometimes certain textures and materials will really trip up the autofocus, especially if the steering hub is debossed. So really make sure you have a sharp image, even if it means you have to take a dozen of the same shot. For a lot of my examples, I've shown these wide interior hero shots, and as a photographer, that's the most satisfying shot, to be able to make that look really good. But for the people who buy and sell cars based on photos, that is not the most important shot. The most important shots are the seats. Seats tell the story of a car, about how it's been cared for, if it's been restored, if it's original, if it's been abused, what kind of life that car has had. It's really important that you shoot these well. You can't take too many photos of seats. I find, particularly with shooting tall bucket seats, you need a wide lens in order to get everything into a horizontal frame. The distance you can step back from the car is limited because part of the door will block your view, so you have to be close and wide, and sometimes the seat barely fits in the frame at 24mm. With seats, even in the shade, sometimes one direction relative to the sun just works better. One seat might look great, and then you go around to the other side and it looks bad, like it's backlit or in a weirder shadow. If for whatever reason it isn't working, sometimes you may have to rotate the car just so you can capture each seat in a favorable light. Now the rest of the interior shots, shifter, gauges, radio, all that, you can probably just point and shoot because you have good baseline settings for everything. So the final thing we'll talk about is adding a bit of flash to the mix. I've mentioned this briefly in the past, and I've been asked to go into more detail about how I use flash with my interior photos. I use a small flash to add some definition and highlights to the interior. It sort of punches up what's there and also allows you to adjust the brightness of the interior compared to the brightness of the scene outside the car. This is a Godox V1 speed light with the Godox flash trigger. This is not sponsored. It's just a basic setup, but I find it really convenient and affordable. Actually, first we have to do an extremely basic lesson in flash photography. If this is too boring or remedial or not relevant to you, just skip ahead. We talked about shutter speed, aperture, and ISO as being the primary ways to adjust the exposure level in every photo. Flash is a fourth factor. It doesn't necessarily affect the exposure parameters, but by adjusting the power output of the flash, we adjust how much light comes into your photo. Whenever we use flash, we still want to adjust those camera exposure parameters. So it's best to have your camera in manual mode, and it's really important to understand how those camera settings affect your image when a flash is fired. Aperture affects both the ambient light and the level of light from the flash in your photo. ISO affects both the ambient light and the level of light from the flash in your photo. Both of these are proportional. Open the aperture or raise the ISO and it lets in more ambient light as well as more light from the flash. But shutter speed is different. Adjusting the shutter speed will not have an effect on flash in your photo because the flash fires in less than 1,000th of a second. So if your shutter speed is at 1/200th of a second or 1/50th, both exposures will receive the same amount of light from the flash. A faster shutter speed lets in less ambient light, but the same amount of light from flash. By adjusting the shutter speed, you can shift the balance between the amount of sunlight in your image versus the amount of light from the flash. Now let's apply this to the interior photo. I have the flash on a stand or tripod pointed into the opposite side window from the side I'm shooting. This is considered off-camera flash because the position of the flash is different from the perspective of the camera, and that's what makes the light look rich and interesting. If the flash was firing from directly on the camera, it would look like it was shot by a creepy, no-talent hack, and we don't want that. I always start with the flash on a low output, like 1/128 power, because I don't want to massively overpower the ambient light. I might raise the power output a little bit depending on the scene and the interior color, but it's easy to overdo it. The camera might be at ISO 1000 to bring in a lot of ambient light. The light from the flash brings a nice highlight to bring emphasis to important surfaces like the steering wheel and dash, but the flash is not the primary light source. If we lit this only with flash, we'd have too many areas in shadow, and that's not what we want for this shot. Now when I shoot from the passenger side, the flash is situated next to the steering wheel, which makes it trickier to avoid hitting the steering wheel with too much light. Sometimes I try to point it at the far corner of the dashboard, and sometimes I even end up having to turn off the flash if the steering wheel is too bright. It just kind of depends. I might use the flash for some dashboard details once it's all set up, or shifter or something, but I don't shoot the whole interior this way because you'll waste a lot of time setting up and adjusting the lighting for each angle. So that is how I use flash. It's a light touch, and this setup is so basic that it's fairly quick and predictable to do without much hassle, and I think it makes the interior photos look as impactful as a good exterior photo. So that is my convoluted and dense guide to car interior photography. I showed the basics. You can definitely do more artistic things. You could shoot details at f1.8. You can get very creative. But most of the time, people are looking at photos of the interior. It's to see the condition or the spec, and this guide will help you show the full interior faithfully and accurately. If you have more tips I left out, please comment below. I'm gonna go drink some water because I've been talking forever. Please like and subscribe, and maybe even share this video, and I will see you next time.